we've heard about representational alignment today, and let me make sure we're not muted. We heard about representational alignment today in neuroscience, cognitive science, a little bit in machine learning. For our last talk of the session, and actually our last talk of the conference, we're going to hear a little bit about representational alignment with robots and humans. And delivering that talk for us is going to be Andreea Bobu, who, as of very recently, updated her affiliation. She's now a research scientist at Boston Dynamics AI Institute, I should say, which is not the same thing as just Boston Dynamics. And she's also an incoming assistant professor at MIT, where we are super excited to have her nearby and be able to work with her. Maybe we'll wait 10 more seconds for the coffee and then we'll start. But for now, everyone, please welcome Andreea.
Thank you for the introduction. Let me know when I can get started.
Yeah. I think we're ready with the coffees? Give me 5 more seconds. Are we good? Are we done with the coffees? All right, perfect. Please take it away, Andreea.
Great, thank you so much. So sad to not be able to have made it in person, but alas, nevertheless, I'm super excited to share with you a little bit about my work on aligning human and robot representations today. And for those of you who don't know me, this is pretty much me in a nutshell. I develop robot algorithms that learn from people from various forms of data from them. And the reason I do that is because I believe that if we want robots to not just live in a vacuum, they have to be capable to adapt to the people that they're interacting with. So we're running an example that we're going to go with. Imagine that this Jaco robot wants to carry this mug over to my lab mate here on the left. So here, Jaco can generate trajectories I that optimize some pre-specified reward function R. Typically in robotics, this reward function is parameterized by some theta that encodes a trade-off between important features phi of the task, things like the cup orientation, the distance to other objects, or efficiency. So here, Jaco starts off only caring about being efficient, and so it follows this shortest path to goal. But then, as I see it do the task, I notice that it's carrying the cup a little bit too high from the table. So something that I could do is I could push on Jaco to correct it, and it updates to that. So the robot can use my correction to now adapt to how I wanted the task to be done and stay closer to the table to deliver the mug to my lab mate. So this is kind of one example in robotics of robots adapting to people and to the way that they want tasks to be done. And in fact, I recently was on this AI floor at Berkeley with brilliant people who similarly think about getting robots to do hard tasks for humans. And as an example, here they wanted to create a robot butler that can serve wine to customers. And they came up with something like this. So from an AI perspective, this robot is an amazing feat of robotics. You have this robot that can carry the glass incredibly fast without spilling a single drop of wine and without breaking the glass. That's pretty impressive. From a human user perspective side, though, I don't know about you, but if this is how the robot behaved around me, I would be pretty terrified. So while this robot achieves something really impressive, it fails to consider that a real customer would probably not be too satisfied because they'd be too scared of the robot spilling or breaking the glass. And so we're seeing this amazing progress in getting robots to work really well in isolation, but we're still a little far from getting them to do the same thing around people. And we see consequences of this all the time in the news. On the left, we have this Uber crash in Arizona in 2018, where the autonomous car fatally hit a jaywalking pedestrian simply because it wasn't programmed to know about the wild concept of jaywalking pedestrians. It only knew about pedestrians at crosswalks. And then on the right side, you kind of had the flip side of this, where the human this time, the human pilot, didn't know about this new feature that was programmed into the MCAS flight control system. And it couldn't understand they couldn't understand what it was doing, which caused them to enter a tug of war, ultimately nosediving into the ocean. So human-robot interaction is still really hard. And to understand the reason underlying these kinds of failures, I want to share with you an example of failed human-human interaction.
Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
The same.
The same? Okay, now watch. Now, does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
That one has more quarters.
That one has more quarters?
Yeah.
Why does that one have more quarters?
Because it's stretched out.
So here's this child that's clearly missing something, right? He's missing this concept of conservation of certain properties, in this case, count. That's very normal for a child this age. This doesn't develop until a little bit later. But without understanding this concept, the child is making the wrong inferences to the researcher's question. And not only that, but he's also able to explain his wrong answers with other concepts that he does know about that are actually quite unrelated. And so let's take this example and translate it into our robot Jaco. And let's say that this time I actually want the robot to not carry the cup above my personal laptop. The problem is that the robot has no notion of distance from laptops. And so without that, it can't learn well from my push, and even worse, it latches onto these other features like distance to table to do its task, similarly to how the child was latching onto these other concepts to answer the researcher's questions. And so, in my view, our biggest obstacle to successful human-robot interaction is the fact that these representations between humans and robots are more often than not misaligned. And so throughout my PhD that I finished a month and a half ago, I worked on tackling what I call the representation alignment problem. How can the robot align its representation with that of the human that it's interacting with? So far, we've seen the more traditional approach to this problem, where you have a system designer that just hand specifies these feature representations that the robot can then use to learn how to do the task from human input AH, like the corrections that we just saw, but there's many other forms of input. And ultimately optimize this reward to produce trajectories in the world. So this is what we just saw in the previous slides. But unfortunately, this requires the designer to specify every single thing ahead of time, which is pretty unreasonable to assume that you can explicate every single thing that any human in any task in any environment could possibly care about. That's just too large of a space. So some of you might say there's a simple solution to this. Why don't we just learn the features as well? After all, that is what the main thing that the big deep learning revolution has been promising us to enable. We tried that, and let's see what happens. So let's say that if the person keeps the cup, cares about keeping the cup close to this table that we just saw, and a laptop on top of it, spatially the reward function might look something like this, where the lowest reward in yellow is right above the laptop, and then it gets better the closer to the table and the farther from the laptop we look. Now, when the robot is missing a feature like distances to laptops, deep learning tells us that you can just model the missing feature as a neural network, collect a few demonstrations of how to do the task from the person, and then ask them to both extract what's missing implicitly and learn this reward function. But it turns out that when we do this, we've kind of vaguely learned that being around the laptop is bad, but we don't really learn this more fine-grained causal detail of the reward function. And why is that? Well, that's because these demonstrations that we got from the human, they're meant to teach the robot how to do the task. They are not meant for learning the feature representation per se. And so here we're only hoping to learn about the missing feature implicitly from these demonstrations. But by trying to do everything at once, deep learning ends up generalizing pretty poorly. And the implication is that now when I optimize this reward function, I get this pretty suboptimal behavior in contrast to how I would have wanted to do the task. So you have one paradigm that learns good rewards, but requires handcrafted representations, and the other avoid that specification, but does a pretty poor job generalizing. So my question was, can we somehow bridge this gap? Can we have some learning involved, but learn something that's more structured and salient? Well, rather than assuming a representation or learning it from scratch, a core idea in my work was that robots should directly engage with humans in an interactive process for finding a shared representation. And in my work, this has led to a divide and conquer approach to robot learning, where you first focus explicitly on learning the representation alone from some type of human input about it, before using that representation for downstream tasks. So what this means is that we're not stuck with demonstrations. We can now actually design this new type of human input AHP that's explicitly targeted at teaching about the representation and can do that efficiently. And so that's what I've done in my PhD. I've studied how to formalize representation alignment and HRI through a variety of research directions. But today I'm gonna blitz through just a quick taste of these three ideas, each of which plays a critical role in making this vision work. And I'm primarily gonna focus on this first one, on how do we actually learn representations from humans. So let's come back to this example where we had this deep IRL, inverse reinforcement learning, or IRL method that modeled the missing feature as a neural network and learned both the representation and the reward kind of all at once from demonstrations. So what if instead of trying to do everything at once, we applied our divide and conquer philosophy and first focused on learning the feature by asking the human for some sort of mystery human input about it that I'll tell you about in just a second. And only then learn the reward on top of that new set of features using inputs that are task specific, like demonstrations or corrections. So that's what we're going to do. But what exactly is this representation specific input, the input that's going to help us learn the feature? Well, if we model the feature as a neural network, the most naive supervised learning approach here would be to just ask the person for labels, representing the feature value at different states in the world. And then you can just use these labels to supervise the training of the neural network directly. The problem is that to cover the space, the state space, the robot would need so many labels from the person that it's extremely infeasible to do something like this. And even worse, humans can actually be very imprecise at labeling states directly. Something like 0.32 doesn't really make much sense to us. Turns out we can address the second problem by instead asking the person to provide relative labels, comparing the feature values in pairs of states. And now we can train our neural network using the Bradley-Terry model for pairwise comparison. So you don't ask them for absolute labels, they just need to tell you this is better than this. The problem is that still you need way too many comparisons to be able to cover the space. So my take on this problem was that humans are actually a lot more intelligent and capable than just giving you 0, 1 labels, so long as we give them the right way to give us data. And so I wanted here a type of human input that about a feature that is informative, but at the same time doesn't place too much sample complexity burden on the person. So my idea was that we can pack more information if we ask the person for a sequence of states with feature values that are monotonically decreasing. And we call a sequence with this property a feature trace. And now the robot can automatically extract these comparisons that we were looking after, but it does that automatically by exploiting this monotonicity. So in practice, if I want to teach the robot about the distance to laptop that I was missing, I start somewhere where the feature is highly expressed, so above the laptop, and move the robot monotonically towards a place where the feature is not highly expressed, so away from the laptop. After the robot collects a few of these traces, it can learn a feature function that's defined by them. So I want us to also walk through how the robot can take advantage of the structure that's inherent to feature traces and convert them into those state comparisons automatically. And so we're going to look at the assumptions that we have that are kind of built into these feature traces. So first, we know that feature traces satisfy this monotonicity assumption. So we know that the feature values approximately decrease along the states of the trace. What this means is that we can take any ordered combination of two states along a trace and label that as one, because the first state in the tuple, we know that it has a higher feature value than following states. And what's really special about this is that for every one trace, we end up with a number of tuples of comparisons that is quadratic in the length of the trace, which is a ton of data. And you get this for every trace. And if you have like 10 traces, then you get hundreds of comparisons for free. The second thing we know is that we can relate feature values across traces, because we also know that the feature traces they start high and then they go low. So what that means is that for any two traces, the feature values for the starts should be consistently high, and the same for the ends, where the feature values should be consistently low, which gives us equivalence tuples, this time with a label of 0.5 to symbolize equal preference. So what we can do is we can incorporate our tuples data set together with this Bradley-Terry loss up top, Bradley-Terry model up top. We incorporate it into just a simple cross entropy loss and train a multi-layer perceptron. So now I want to showcase some examples of the features that we were able to train this way from both expert users, aka me, on a physical robot, as well as non-experts in an online user study with the simulated JCO. The study was done online, unfortunately, because of COVID. This was happening back in 2021. So for all evaluations, we sample a large test set of states in the robot's reachable set. So you have these, the 3D ball of points on the left. And here we color them with the color of the feature values. So here you see that the laptop feature is high in yellow, and then it gets blue as you go farther from the laptop. And also for easier visualization, we can take this 3D ball and project it down on some representative plane. When we look at the ground truth laptop feature, we see a projected ball that decreases in intensity the farther from the laptop we look. Turns out that when we trained our method with traces from the expert user, we get something that learns a very structurally similar feature. And this result held across 6 different features, spatial features of varying complexity that we tested. I'm not going to get into the depths of what these results are, but I want you to keep in mind that all of these features are obtained with somewhere around 10 or 20 feature traces, not the thousands or hundreds of demonstrations they would have needed for the end-to-end procedure otherwise. Now, we also wanted to do this with not experts users, so not me. We wanted to know, can non-expert users in a user study also use these feature traces to teach the robot features? So what we see is that for the laptop features, people similarly were able to give these feature traces that kind of start the laptop and move away from it. And we recover this projected ball on the bottom that looks very similar to what we just saw on the previous slide. For distance to table, they covered the space vertically from up to down. And my personal favorite is this proxemics feature, which is the idea that people really don't like to have things in front of their face more so than to their sides. And so my favorite thing is that participants were able to figure out that the way to teach this is to give traces that are longer in front of them and then shorter and shorter to their sides. So that was pretty cool. You recovered this feature ball that kind of looks like a half ellipsis. That's kind of consistent with my description of the feature. This idea of learning features effectively from human supervision, we've managed to generalize it to more complicated tasks. Like here we had perceptual features, which the robot can learn and use directly from the camera input. So here we're able to learn about the concept of above. And we're also able to learn emotion features, which the robot can use to produce expressive motion. So tiptoeing when it's afraid or stomping aggressively when it's angry. So now that we've seen an example of how we can learn features one by one, how does the robot even know when its representation is misaligned in the first place? How does it know that it's missing something? So I'm going to spend just a quick minute on this, but going back to the scenario, recall that without knowing this feature, the robot is just kind of blindly learning to stay close to the table, which is not what I wanted. And I don't want this to happen. I don't want the robot to mistakenly learn bad behaviors. Instead, in this project, we wanted to ask, is there a way in which the robot can autonomously figure out that my push refers to something that it just doesn't know about? Well, since when people act, they don't just do so randomly, we use the so-called Boltzmann-Noisily rational model from cognitive psychology to model people as selecting inputs in proportion to their exponentiated reward. So the higher the reward of the input, the exponentially more likely it is to pick it. And what's interesting about this model is this coefficient beta, which models how rational or optimal the person is, and it's typically fixed to be something reasonably high. The thing is that when you fix it to something high, you're essentially assuming that humans are just naturally going to be rational and all their inputs should be trusted. But that's not what we're doing here in this project. Since we're trying to detect misalignment, we know that this assumption isn't necessarily going to hold. So instead, we've reinterpreted beta as a confidence for how well the robot's representation can explain this human input AH theta, and we inferred it along the way with theta. So in practice, what this means is that when the human and the robot representations are well aligned, the robot will estimate a high confidence on the correct intent theta that explains the human input. So in this case, staying closer to the table and being efficient, and thus the robot can learn assuredly from the human's input. If you have misalignment, the robot is going to estimate a low confidence across its representation. So there's no theta that can possibly explain the human's input, and therefore we don't want the robot to learn from inputs that it does not understand. So back to our beginning example, this time when I push on the robot, it infers a low confidence, which maps to no longer incorrectly learning to stay close to the table. Importantly, we are not hand-tuning this behavior in this project. In fact, the robot is able to autonomously monitor this confidence beta in its representation and can then learn in proportion to it, as we did here, or in more safety-critical scenarios, you could just stop execution entirely. So we compared the two methods in a real user study, and here we see that when there is no misalignment, so both the robot and the human know about the distance to table, both methods learn perfectly accurately to stay close to the table, so they don't differ. When things get interesting, though, and is when there is misalignment. So this time, the robot doesn't know about distance to table. It only knows about cup orientation. And so the robot incorrectly infers from the human's push that the human wants the cup to be tipped over. And so the human has to not only correct it to stay close to the table, they have to also correct for tipping over the cup. Meanwhile, with our method, because we're estimating confidence, you're going to see that the robot is not tipping over the cup incorrectly anymore because it knows that it can't understand the human's input. Obviously, this doesn't mean that it's magically able to understand the human's input to stay closer to the table, but it's able to be robust to unintended learning that is happening on the left. And so I showed this paradigm for learning from corrections, but we're able to generalize this to other forms of human feedback. You can learn it. You can do this confidence and estimation beta from demonstrations, for teleoperations, and so on. And lastly, to then properly learn from and interpret people's task input, the robot needs a model for how people make choices. And we just saw the old Boltzmann model as our model of choice, but in this project, we actually found it to be quite unintuitive, and we found that a more natural model should use the newly learned human-aligned representations to adjust for any similarity that the potential trajectory choices might have. And we ran a user study that shows that this model does indeed get closer to how people make choices, and this has implications beyond robotics to cognitive science and econometrics. So overall, when we put all of these components together, we're now able to learn some rewards that are a lot closer to the ground truth. So they're a lot more generalizable than just doing everything end to end. So dividing and conquering helps quite a lot in this case. And this means that now the robot can actually do the task in the way that I wanted from the beginning. It can stay close to the table and also not stay too close to my laptop when it's carrying the cup. I kind of wanted to end with a few ideas for the future of this burgeoning field of representation alignment and robotics. And I wanted to point out that we started by putting forward this vision of engaging with humans in an interactive process for arriving at shared representations. But my work has really only looked at this very standard approach, which has the human in the teacher role, sort of feeding the robot data about their representation. But in reality, seamless human-robot collaboration should demand more than just passive data absorption. This should really be a bidirectional process where the robot is an active participant in this interaction. So what should representation alignment look like in HRI? Well, personal robots will work for and alongside humans, like this Franca cooking assistant, the Astrobee on the space station, this TRI robot in the home. And here, representation alignment should enable the robot to easily learn new tasks from the human as the context changes, but it should also enable the robot to communicate its failure modes in a more transparent way. And I believe that this can ultimately increase the utility of the robot when supporting people, and it can lead to more transparent failure diagnosis. In semi-autonomous driving, where we're ultimately hoping that autonomy can make the pilot or driver's life more easier. We want the robot to behave according to user expectations, and if it doesn't, then it should detect that and relinquish control. And this isn't specific to just experienced pilots. We also want autonomy that can adapt to users of different levels of expertise and preferences and do it in a way that minimizes psychological and physical effort. And ultimately, I think that tackling these challenges would result in more trustworthy driver assistance systems, which will result in more adoption, which will ultimately reduce human burden. I also envision AVs interacting with passengers themselves. Back when I lived in San Francisco in the Bay Area, I saw Waymo had these cars driving around. Luckily, I got to try on. And I immediately thought of the myriad of ways in which the screen interface over here could be used to interactively learn about my own unique requirements and priorities. And so I think there's a large potential for personalization here, whether it's in a grounded or in a flying car. And lastly, in shared autonomy, which is meant to assist and augment human performance. Robots should adapt to different and changing human capabilities as the person learns more about how to teleoperate their robot with time. And ultimately, this will enable more seamless and effective human-robot teams. So to me, all of these exciting avenues are enabled because we're explicitly tackling representation alignment rather than just hoping it will naturally emerge. I'd like to thank all of my collaborators and happy to answer any questions they might have. Thank you.